My name is Rebecca Carter, and the moment I saw my own husband standing outside my late father's attorney's office after the attorney had warned me, "Don't tell your husband or your stepmother. You could be in danger." My blood ran cold. I remember gripping my car keys so tightly they dug into my palm. Mark smiled as though we'd accidentally run into each other while shopping for groceries. But nothing about that morning was ordinary. My father, a retired 3-star Army general, had been buried only 3 days earlier with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Now his attorney was telling me someone close to me couldn't be trusted. As I stood frozen on the sidewalk in Alexandria, Virginia, I realized the man I'd shared 32 years of marriage with might know exactly why. 3 days earlier, I had stood beneath a gray November sky watching soldiers fold an American flag with perfect precision. The sharp commands, the crisp salutes, and the mournful notes of taps drifted across Arlington's quiet hills. Even after all these years, military ceremonies carried a dignity that could silence a crowd without anyone speaking above a whisper. My father, Lieutenant General Thomas Carter, had always believed that discipline wasn't something you turned on for work and off at home. It shaped every part of his life. He woke before sunrise, even after retirement. He polished his shoes whether anyone would notice or not. He wrote handwritten thank you notes instead of sending text messages. Some people found him intimidating. I simply knew him as Dad. We hadn't always agreed. After my mother passed away from breast cancer 20 years earlier, he buried himself in work. I buried myself in raising my own family. Somewhere between his assignments overseas and my career as a public school counselor in Fairfax County, our conversations became shorter. Birthdays turned into phone calls instead of visits. Holidays became weekends that never quite worked out. Still, when he became ill, I visited whenever I could. His second wife, Linda, always seemed to appear whenever Dad and I started talking privately. "Oh, Tom," she'd interrupt cheerfully. "The nurse said you need your medicine." Or she'd remind him he needed rest. Or she'd suddenly remember another visitor waiting downstairs. Looking back now, those interruptions no longer felt accidental. At the funeral reception at Fort Myer, Linda greeted guests with graceful smiles and perfect makeup that somehow never smudged despite her carefully displayed tears. She accepted condolences like someone running a formal reception rather than mourning a husband. I noticed little things. She kept asking Dad's attorney whether probate would take long. She asked where certain financial documents were stored. She laughed a little too easily whenever conversations drifted away from my father himself. Perhaps grief makes us suspicious. At the time, I told myself everyone mourns differently. My husband certainly thought so. "Rebecca," Mark whispered as we drove home after the service, "your father lived a long life. You need to let yourself breathe." "I know." "You've been worrying about him for years." "I know." "You don't have to carry everything anymore." He reached over and squeezed my hand. Normally, that simple gesture would have comforted me. Instead, I found myself staring out the passenger window. Dad's final days kept replaying in my mind. During my last visit to the rehabilitation center in Bethesda, he'd struggled to speak while recovering from another difficult treatment. "Rebecca." "I'm here, Dad." "There are papers." Before he could finish, Linda walked in carrying coffee. "Oh, good," she'd said brightly. "You're awake." Dad closed his mouth. He never brought it up again. I assumed the medication had confused him. Now I wasn't so sure. The phone rang just after 9 on Monday morning. I recognized the number immediately. David Rosen had handled my father's legal affairs for nearly 30 years. His voice sounded unlike anything I'd ever heard. Quiet, measured, almost frightened. "Rebecca, where are you?" "At home." "Are you alone?" I frowned. "Yes. I need you to come to my office immediately." "Is something wrong with the estate?" A long silence followed. "I found something your father left behind." "What kind of something?" "I can't discuss it over the phone." My stomach tightened. "When should I come?" "Now." I reached for my purse. Then he said words I will never forget. "Rebecca." "Yes." "Do not tell your husband where you're going." I laughed nervously. "What?" "And don't tell Linda." The room suddenly felt colder. "David, you're scaring me." "I wish I were mistaken." Another pause. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "You could be in danger." The line went dead. For several minutes, I simply sat there listening to my own heartbeat. Danger. I was a 61-year-old retired school counselor. My biggest worries these days involved arthritis, grocery prices, and remembering my grandson's soccer schedules. Danger belonged in television dramas, not my life. I considered calling Mark. Instead, I remembered David's warning. I hated keeping secrets from my husband. After 32 years together, we usually told each other everything. But something in David's voice convinced me this was different. Mark had left earlier that morning for what he said was a meeting with clients in Tyson's Corner. I texted him. "Running errands, might be home late." Almost immediately he replied, "Everything okay?" Yes, it wasn't exactly a lie. I honestly didn't know. The drive from Fairfax to Alexandria normally took about 40 minutes depending on traffic. That morning, every red light seemed longer. Every unfamiliar car behind me made me glance twice in the mirror. Dad had taught me situational awareness years ago after 9/11. "Always know who's around you," he'd say. For the first time in decades, I found myself following that advice. David's office occupied the second floor of a restored brick building in Old Town Alexandria, only a few blocks from the Potomac River. I'd visited several times over the years. Usually the place felt warm, comforting. Old wood floors, family photographs, law books lining every wall. Today it looked strangely empty. I parked across the street and walked toward the entrance. Halfway there, I noticed someone standing beside the front door. Tall, gray sport coat, hands tucked into his pockets. My steps slowed, then stopped completely. Mark, my husband. He looked up, smiled naturally, and waved. "There you are," he called. "I figured I'd catch you before you went inside." The air seemed to disappear from my lungs. David had told no one. I certainly hadn't. Yet somehow my husband was already waiting outside the attorney's office. He tilted his head with the same familiar smile I'd trusted for over 3 decades. "Funny running into you here," he said. I couldn't answer him right away. The words, "funny running into you here," hung in the chilly November air as if they belonged to someone else. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Mark had always been good at reading me, but for the first time in 32 years I had no idea what he was thinking. "What are you doing here?" I finally asked. He shrugged with practiced ease. "I had a meeting nearby. I saw your car and figured I'd come say hello." It sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. Old Town Alexandria wasn't exactly small, and David Rosen's office sat on a quiet side street that few people drove past unless they had business there. "You never told me you were coming here," he added. "I was running errands." His smile remained, but his eyes lingered on my face a little too long. "Errands with Dad's attorney." Before I could answer, the office door opened. David Rosen stepped outside carrying a leather briefcase. He was 73, thin, impeccably dressed, and usually impossible to rattle. Today, however, the color drained from his face the moment he saw Mark. "Rebecca?" His eyes shifted briefly toward my husband. "I wasn't expecting company." Mark extended his hand. "Good morning, David." David accepted the handshake politely but without warmth. "Mark." The silence that followed felt heavier than either greeting. Mark glanced at me. "Mind if I come in? This concerns the family, doesn't it?" David answered before I could. "I'm afraid today's meeting is confidential." Mark laughed softly. "Rebecca doesn't keep secrets from me." David met my eyes instead of his. "Actually, General Carter specifically instructed that today's discussion be with Rebecca alone." Mark's smile faded almost imperceptibly. "Dad said that." David nodded. "It was his written instruction." For a brief second, I caught something in Mark's expression I had never seen before. Not anger. Calculation. He recovered almost instantly. "Well," he said lightly, "I'll grab a coffee while you two talk." He kissed my cheek. The gesture felt oddly rehearsed. "Call me when you're finished." As he walked away, I turned to watch him disappear around the corner. Only after he was gone did David quietly say, "He shouldn't have known you were here." Neither of us spoke again until we reached his office upstairs. The familiar room suddenly felt different. David locked the front door. Then he checked the blinds before motioning for me to sit. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" "I should have contacted you sooner." He placed an old military green file box on the conference table. The cardboard looked worn around the edges. Across the top in my father's unmistakable handwriting were 6 simple words. "For Rebecca alone." My throat tightened. David rested one hand on the box. "Your father delivered this to me 6 months ago. He knew he was dying. He suspected he might not have much time." My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside were several leather-bound journals, a stack of sealed envelopes, property records, bank statements, military correspondence, and a small encrypted flash drive taped beneath one folder. Everything had been organized with military precision. Dad had labeled every section. Evidence, financial records, personal notes, if necessary. David handed me one envelope. This should be first. My father's handwriting covered the front. Rebecca, only if I cannot explain this myself. I opened it carefully. The paper smelled faintly of his study where he'd always kept cedar blocks inside his desk drawers. His handwriting remained steady despite his illness. Rebecca, if you're reading this, someone I trusted has betrayed me. I stopped breathing for a moment. The next sentence made my stomach knot. Trust no one until you've read everything. I looked up. What is this? David sighed. For the last 4 years, your father conducted a private investigation. Into what? Fraud. That wasn't the answer I expected. What kind of fraud? Defense contracting. He slid several financial reports across the table. After retirement, General Carter served on advisory boards for veterans' housing initiatives. I nodded. I remembered those volunteer positions. Dad had been passionate about helping wounded veterans transition back into civilian life. He began noticing discrepancies. Millions of dollars allocated for veterans' rehabilitation projects simply disappeared. I stared at the documents. Invoices, audits, construction budgets. Every page carried handwritten notes in Dad's careful block lettering. He believed contractors were inflating costs and diverting federal funds. Did he report it? He tried. David removed another folder. Unfortunately, some of the people responsible were politically connected. My father had never been interested in politics. He believed laws applied equally to everyone. Apparently, someone else disagreed. I turned another page. A company logo appeared at the top. Hamilton Strategic Solutions. The name struck me immediately. I've seen this before. David looked at me carefully. I suspected you had. My husband consults for them. Neither of us spoke. The silence answered the question neither wanted to ask. David folded his hands. I verified that before calling you. You think Mark's involved? I don't know. You must. I know only facts. He pushed another document toward me. This consulting agreement lists your husband. The signature belonged to Mark. The contract date stunned me. Nearly 5 years earlier. Much earlier than he'd ever mentioned working with the company. Why would he hide this? I can't answer that. I leaned back slowly. My entire marriage suddenly felt unstable. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. There had to be. Mark wasn't dishonest. He couldn't be. Could he? David reached into his desk drawer. There is something else. He produced a printed security report. My office building has surveillance cameras. I scanned the pages. 2 attempted break-ins. One last week, another just 2 nights ago. Nothing had been stolen. They were searching. For this box. I believe so. Did you call police? I did. They found nothing. He leaned closer. Rebecca, your father anticipated this. He pointed toward another envelope. Its label read, "If someone begins asking questions." My hands shook again. Dad had planned for possibilities I couldn't even imagine. David lowered his voice. Whatever General Carter uncovered frightened someone. Outside church bells echoed faintly across Old Town. Everything felt strangely normal beyond those windows. People walked dogs. Couples carried shopping bags. Cars stopped at traffic lights. Meanwhile, my father's final months had apparently been spent collecting evidence against powerful people. And somehow my husband was connected to one of the companies under investigation. I don't know who to trust anymore, I whispered. David answered gently. For today, he looked directly into my eyes. Trust your father. I closed the box. I'll take everything home. He hesitated. Hide it well. The drive back to Fairfax felt much longer than the drive there. Every conversation I'd ever had with Mark replayed inside my head. Every business trip. Every late meeting. Every vague explanation. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had almost convinced myself I was imagining connections that didn't exist. Mark's SUV was already parked outside. He opened the front door before I reached the porch. How'd it go? He asked casually. Fine. What did David want? Just paperwork. He smiled. Estate stuff. Mostly. For the first time in our marriage, I lied. That evening, I placed my father's box inside an old cedar chest in the basement behind Christmas decorations no one had touched in years. After dinner, I quietly walked upstairs to fold laundry. Halfway down the hall, I heard movement below. I stopped. The basement door creaked. I stood perfectly still. Then I looked through the railing. Mark was kneeling beside the cedar chest, searching. Carefully, methodically. He didn't know I was watching. The sight of Mark kneeling beside that cedar chest rooted me to the spot. For a few seconds I couldn't even breathe. He wasn't wandering through the basement looking for a flashlight or a box of holiday decorations. He had pulled everything out with deliberate care. The old artificial Christmas tree leaned against the wall. Storage bins were stacked in neat rows around him. He was searching one place and one place only. The cedar chest. The one place I'd hidden my father's box less than an hour earlier. I stepped back before he could look up and quietly retreated into our bedroom. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain he would hear it through the floor. A minute later I heard the basement door close. His footsteps came up the stairs at an unhurried pace. He walked into the bedroom carrying a basket of clean towels. "I found these downstairs," he said casually. I looked up from the sweater I was pretending to fold. "Oh, you okay?" "Just tired. It has been a rough week." He kissed the top of my head before walking into the bathroom. The tenderness felt genuine. That was the hardest part. If he was lying, he'd become frighteningly good at it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad's handwriting. If you're reading this, someone I trusted betrayed me. Who had he meant? Linda. Mark. Someone else entirely. At 5:30 the next morning, I got out of bed without waking my husband. Dad always believed difficult mornings should begin with coffee before decisions. I followed his routine. Standing alone in the kitchen, I poured a cup and stared through the window into our backyard, now covered with frost. The maple tree Dad had planted when our oldest son was born had already dropped every leaf. Winter was arriving. So was the truth. By 8 o'clock, I was back in David Rosen's office. He looked relieved to see me. "You brought the box." "No." His eyebrows lifted. "I decided it was safer hidden somewhere else." "Good. I need to know everything." He nodded. I was expecting that. He unlocked a tall filing cabinet and removed another folder marked Confidential. General Carter didn't trust electronic records alone. Inside were copies of emails, handwritten notes, and photographs. The first photograph showed Linda sitting at an outdoor cafe in Georgetown. Across from her sat two men in expensive business suits. One of them wore a gold watch I recognized immediately. I leaned closer. "No." David said nothing. The man was Mark. The date stamped on the photograph was nearly 6 years old. I stared at it in disbelief. "That's impossible." "Why?" "Mark told me he didn't meet Linda until our wedding anniversary dinner 3 years ago." David slid over another photograph. Same cafe. Different day. Same two people. Then another. A parking garage. Another. A hotel lobby. The dates stretched back years. Far longer than either of them had admitted. My mouth went dry. They knew each other. It appears so. They lied. It appears so. I rubbed my temples. No, there has to be some explanation. David didn't argue. He simply handed me another document. It was an airline itinerary. Mark. Linda. Same destination. Dallas. 5 years earlier. 3-day conference sponsored by Hamilton Strategic Solutions. I remembered that trip. Mark had told me he was attending a financial technology seminar in Chicago. I'd even picked him up at Reagan National Airport when he returned. Or at least I thought I had. My memories suddenly felt unreliable. How did my father get all this? David folded his hands. He hired a licensed private investigator after noticing inconsistencies. He investigated Linda, initially, and then he began seeing your husband's name repeatedly. I closed my eyes. Dad had suspected something for years, yet he never confronted me. Why? Almost as if reading my thoughts, David opened one of the journals. Your father had written, "Rebecca loves deeply. If I'm wrong, I destroy her marriage for nothing. If I'm right, I must have proof before speaking." Tears blurred the ink. That sounded exactly like him. Careful, measured, never accusing without evidence. He was trying to protect me. He was. But he ran out of time. David nodded quietly. Over the next 3 hours, we organized every document chronologically. A disturbing picture slowly emerged. Hamilton Strategic Solutions had received several lucrative federal contracts connected to veterans' housing projects. Construction costs ballooned. Buildings remained unfinished. Money disappeared into subcontractors that barely existed. Some shell companies were registered to empty office buildings. Others listed retired people who had no idea their identities had been used. Dad's handwritten notes connected names, dates, and payments with military precision. He hadn't been guessing. He'd been documenting. Then David handed me the encrypted flash drive. The password? He smiled sadly. He left instructions. He handed me a sealed card. Inside, Dad had written only one sentence. "The day you caught your first fish." Despite everything, I laughed softly. I was 8 years old. Lake Anna. The password was the date. The drive unlocked immediately. Hundreds of folders appeared. Financial spreadsheets, recorded interviews, scanned contracts, photos, videos, and one folder labeled "Evidence Against My Family." My hand froze on the mouse. I don't think I'm ready. No one ever is. I opened it. The first file was a video. Dad had secretly recorded himself at his desk. His face looked older than I remembered, more tired. "If you're watching this," he began, "then I've probably failed to finish what I started." I felt tears building again. He looked directly into the camera. "Rebecca, if Mark is still in your life, be careful." My breath caught. "I pray I'm wrong." He paused. "But every piece of evidence points in the same direction." He picked up several photographs. "I believe your husband didn't accidentally enter our family." Another pause. "I believe he was sent." The room became utterly silent. Even David looked away. I couldn't accept it. Not after 32 years. Not after raising children together. Not after birthdays, anniversaries, illnesses, vacations, grandchildren. People couldn't fake that much of a life. Could they? Dad continued speaking. "I've learned that greed rarely begins with stealing money. It begins with convincing yourself people are simply opportunities." The recording ended. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, I whispered, "I need air." David walked me downstairs. The cold November wind hit my face like icy water. I stood on the sidewalk trying to steady myself. Across the street, people came and went from cafes carrying coffee cups. Life continued as though nothing had changed. Then I noticed something. A dark SUV, parked half a block away, engine running. Windows tinted. It had been there when I arrived. I hadn't thought anything of it. Now the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked directly at me, then calmly raised his phone and took my picture. Before I could react, he climbed back into the SUV and drove away. David had seen him too. Neither of us said a word. We didn't have to. Someone else knew I had opened my father's files. The dark SUV disappeared into late morning traffic before either of us could read the license plate. David grabbed my elbow. "Get back inside. I want to call the police." "You will." His voice remained calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw. "First, we need to make sure no one followed you here." We hurried upstairs and locked the office door behind us. David immediately called the Alexandria Police Department and reported the suspicious vehicle. An officer arrived within 30 minutes, took our statements, and explained that without a plate number or a clear photograph of the driver, there wasn't much they could do beyond filing an incident report. "I don't want to frighten you," the officer said kindly, "but if you believe you're being watched, don't stay alone. Call us if anything else happens." When he left, I looked at David. Someone is nervous. They should be. I thought about my father's words. Greed begins with convincing yourself people are opportunities. For years, I had believed my life was wonderfully ordinary. Now I felt like a character inside someone else's investigation. David picked up the phone again. "This is the call your father hoped I'd never have to make." He dialed a number from memory. After only 2 rings, someone answered. "Bill, it's David." A pause. "Yes. I'm activating Tom's contingency plan." Another pause. "I'll explain when you get here." He hung up. "Who's Bill?" "William Donovan. The retired Colonel Dad used to fish with." "The same one." Colonel Donovan had served with my father decades earlier. After retirement, he'd worked in military procurement and later consulted on federal ethics investigations. I remembered him as a quiet man who never wasted words. "He knows about this. He knows enough." 45 minutes later, Bill Donovan walked into the office wearing blue jeans, a brown field jacket, and the expression of someone who had expected bad news. He hugged me gently. "I'm sorry about your father." "So am I." He sat down across from us. David handed him the flash drive. Bill didn't even look surprised. "So Tom finally opened the vault. You knew—" Bill nodded. "Not everything, but enough." He leaned back. "Your father came to me almost 4 years ago. What did he say?" "He said, Bill, either I'm chasing ghosts, or someone has built a very expensive criminal enterprise using veterans as cover." My chest tightened. "Did you believe him?" "I told him to prove it." "And he did." Bill gave a slow nod. "He certainly did." For the next 2 hours, Bill filled in pieces my father had never shared with me. The fraud had started small. A few inflated invoices, a handful of fake subcontractors. Nothing that immediately attracted attention. Then federal spending increased for veterans' housing rehabilitation centers and accessibility renovations. Suddenly, millions of dollars were flowing through private contractors. Someone realized oversight was weak. According to Bill, the operation expanded quietly over nearly a decade. Projects looked legitimate. Ribbon-cutting ceremonies happened. Politicians smiled for cameras. Meanwhile, buildings remained unfinished. Veterans waited months longer for housing. Wheelchair-accessible apartments were never completed. Counseling programs quietly lost funding. They weren't stealing from the government, Bill said. They were stealing from veterans. Hearing it phrased that way made me physically sick. My father had spent 40 years wearing the uniform. No wonder he couldn't let it go. That afternoon we reviewed more files. One spreadsheet listed shell companies, another traced wire transfers. Then I opened a folder labeled Personal Surveillance. My stomach tightened. There were hundreds of photographs. Linda entering restaurants, executives leaving office buildings, private meetings, parking garages, airport terminals. Most appeared completely ordinary. Then I reached another photograph. Mark, standing beside Linda. Neither knew the picture had been taken. They weren't simply greeting each other. They were hugging. Not romantically, comfortably, like people who had known each other for years. The date, 7 years earlier, I whispered. They lied to me. Bill looked at the photograph. They certainly knew each other. I kept scrolling. Another picture. Mark handing Linda a large envelope. Another. The two of them leaving a hotel conference room. Another. Standing outside a bank. Everything inside me wanted a reasonable explanation. Business. Coincidence. Anything. Instead, the evidence kept stacking higher. Bill finally closed the laptop. Rebecca. What? From this point forward, assume every phone call is monitored. I stared. Excuse me. If this network is as sophisticated as Tom believed, they may have access to far more than financial records. You mean my phone? I'm saying be careful. David nodded. Your father stopped discussing important matters electronically nearly 2 years ago. I suddenly remembered something. Dad had insisted we meet in person for lunch whenever he wanted to discuss family matters. I'd teased him for refusing video calls. He'd simply smiled. I like seeing people face to face. Now I wondered if there had been another reason. That evening I returned home before Mark. The house felt strangely unfamiliar. I walked from room to room looking at family photographs, our wedding, Christmas mornings, grandchildren opening presents, beach vacations. 32 years captured in smiling pictures. Had any of it been real? Or had I been the only one living that life honestly? At 6:15, Mark came home carrying takeout from our favorite Italian restaurant. I figured neither of us felt like cooking. He smiled warmly. The same smile I'd fallen in love with decades ago. Dinner felt painfully normal. He talked about traffic, a difficult client, our grandson's upcoming birthday. I answered politely. Then he casually asked, "So did David finish the estate paperwork?" "Almost. Anything interesting?" "No." He nodded. "Good." His eyes searched mine. For a split second I thought he knew I was lying. Instead he changed the subject. Around 10 that night, after Mark had gone upstairs, I quietly returned to the basement. The cedar chest remained exactly where I'd left it. I knelt beside it. The box was still inside, untouched. At least it appeared untouched. Something caught my attention. A tiny scratch near the brass lock. It hadn't been there before. I opened the lid. Everything looked normal. Christmas ornaments, old quilts, family photo albums. Then I noticed it. The journals. They were stacked in the opposite direction. Someone had opened the box and carefully tried to put everything back exactly as they'd found it. Almost. I quickly counted the journals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There should have been 6. My father's oldest journal was gone. My heart began racing. Someone had entered the house, not to steal jewelry, not to take electronics. Only one journal. Only one specific piece of evidence. As I stood there frozen, I heard something behind me. A floorboard creaked. I spun around. No one. The basement was empty. Then I noticed a single folded piece of white paper lying near the bottom step. It hadn't been there minutes earlier. My hands trembled as I picked it up. 3 words had been typed in black ink. "Stop digging, Rebecca." No signature. No fingerprints. Just the message. Someone had been inside my home. And they wanted me to know it. The typed note remained in my trembling hands long after I had finished reading it. "Stop digging, Rebecca." There was something almost polite about the message. No profanity. No dramatic threats. Just 3 words. That frightened me more than if someone had written, "I'll kill you." Whoever had left it wasn't trying to scare me into panicking. They were trying to convince me they could enter my home whenever they wished. I slipped the note into a plastic freezer bag without touching it again. Dad had taught me enough detective stories over the years to know fingerprints mattered. Whether any usable prints remained was another question. I quietly climbed the basement stairs. Mark was asleep upstairs, or at least I assumed he was. For several minutes I stood outside our bedroom door listening. Soft, steady breathing. I opened the door carefully. He lay on his side facing the window. Nothing seemed unusual, yet I found myself wondering something I never imagined asking. Was he really asleep? The next morning I called David before Mark woke up. I found a note. He didn't ask what it said. Instead he asked, "Did they take anything?" "One journal." A long silence followed. "Come to my office. I think someone's been inside my house." "I know." His answer startled me. "What?" "The missing journal tells me exactly what they were searching for." "How can you know that?" "Because Tom warned me." An hour later I sat across from David and Bill Donovan once again. The plastic bag containing the note rested on the conference table. Bill examined it without touching the paper. "They're escalating." David unlocked another drawer in his desk. "I hoped I wouldn't need this." He removed a sealed envelope. Across the front in my father's handwriting were the words, "Open only if they find the journals." I closed my eyes. Dad had anticipated this too. David carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single typed page. At the top, my father had written, "If they've taken a journal, then they don't know I made copies." Bill smiled for the first time all week. "That's Tom." David reached beneath a bookshelf. Hidden behind a row of military history books was a small fireproof safe. He spun the combination, opened the door. Inside sat 6 identical leather journals. Duplicates. Every page had been photocopied years earlier. I laughed through tears. "Dad outsmarted them?" "He spent 40 years planning military operations," Bill replied. He rarely relied on one copy of anything. For the first time since Dad's funeral, I felt something besides fear. Hope. That afternoon, Bill introduced me to someone new. Her name was Special Agent Karen Morales with the FBI's Public Corruption and Financial Crimes Division. She met us in a federal office building in Washington, D.C. She was in her early 50s, calm, direct, and clearly familiar with my father's investigation. "I've heard General Carter's name for over 2 years," she said after we were seated. I looked surprised. "You knew about him?" "We knew someone was quietly collecting evidence." "You couldn't protect him?" "We didn't know who he was until very late." She folded her hands. "Your father never contacted us directly." "He didn't?" "No," Bill answered for her. "He was trying to finish documenting the network before making accusations." Karen nodded. "Frankly, he gathered evidence more thoroughly than many professional investigators." She spent nearly 3 hours reviewing the journals. Occasionally she'd underline something. Sometimes she'd ask questions. By late afternoon she leaned back. "This is enough." "For what?" "To request federal search warrants." My pulse quickened. "So it's over." She shook her head. "No, it's beginning." Karen explained the investigation had already uncovered suspicious financial activity involving several contractors. Dad's records connected people investigators hadn't yet identified. More importantly, his journals established motive, timeline, meetings, payments, patterns. He filled in missing pieces. She looked directly at me. "But we still need witnesses." "I'll testify." "I expected you would." Then her expression became serious. "Rebecca." "Yes. From this point forward, do exactly what we ask." "What does that mean?" "It means you continue behaving normally. You want me to go home?" "I do." "To Mark." "Especially to Mark." The room fell silent. "You think he's involved?" "I think he knows more than he's admitted." That wasn't the same thing, but it was close enough. Over the following week, my life became a strange performance. Every morning I drank coffee with my husband. Every evening we watched the local news together. We talked about grocery shopping, our grandchildren, the weather. Meanwhile, I secretly met with FBI agents almost daily. Karen equipped me with something I never imagined wearing. A tiny digital recorder hidden inside a decorative pendant. "I've never done anything like this." "You don't have to interrogate him," she reassured me. "Just let him talk." The opportunity came sooner than expected. One Saturday afternoon, Mark was helping me organize paperwork in the dining room. Stacks of estate documents covered the table. He picked up one folder. Linda says the probate process is moving too slowly. I'm sure it is. She thinks your father's records should simply be turned over. I looked up. Why would she say that? He shrugged. Less confusion. I pretended to keep sorting papers. What records? Oh, you know. He hesitated. His notebooks. My hands stopped moving. I never mentioned notebooks. His face changed. Only for a second. Then he smiled. I assumed military officers kept journals. You assumed? Sure. I looked directly into his eyes. Dad did keep journals. Mark froze. It was barely noticeable. But after 32 years, I knew every expression on his face. Every pause. Every hesitation. He recovered quickly. I figured as much. I nodded slowly. Then I asked the question Karen had suggested. If Dad wrote something important. I kept my tone casual. Would anyone actually care? Mark laughed. You'd be surprised. Really? He shrugged again. Some things are better left buried. The sentence landed like a stone. Not because of what he said. Because of how he said it. Carefully. Deliberately. Almost as though he'd rehearsed it. That evening I delivered the recording to Karen. She listened twice. Then looked at me. He knows. What? He knows those journals matter. Is that enough? No. But it's one more brick. She smiled slightly. And walls eventually collapse. 2 days later, Karen called before sunrise. Her voice carried an energy I hadn't heard before. The warrants have been signed. I sat upright in bed. What happens now? Tomorrow morning. Where? Virginia. Maryland. D.C. Multiple locations. She paused. Then quietly added, when the sun comes up tomorrow, everything changes. Before sunrise the next morning, I sat alone in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Outside Fairfax was just beginning to wake up. A newspaper landed with a soft thud at the end of the driveway. A neighbor walked his golden retriever. School buses would soon begin their routes just as they had for decades. Ordinary life continued. Yet somewhere across Northern Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., federal agents were gathering in parking lots, reviewing warrants, checking radios, and preparing to knock on doors. At exactly 6:00 a.m., my phone vibrated. One message. Stay home, do not contact anyone. It was from Special Agent Karen Morales. I looked upstairs. Mark was still asleep. At least I assumed he was. By 7 o'clock, every television station in the region interrupted its morning programming. Federal agents have executed multiple search warrants involving suspected procurement fraud connected to veterans' housing projects. I turned the volume down before the report continued. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Mark entered the kitchen wearing jeans and a sweater. He glanced at the television. What happened? I don't know. He watched the screen for several seconds. His face remained calm. Too calm. They're saying several companies were searched. I nodded. So it sounds. His phone rang. He looked at the caller ID. For the first time in 32 years, I watched my husband hesitate before answering a phone call. He finally pressed the button. Hello? His expression changed almost immediately. What? A long silence. No, don't say anything else. Another pause. I understand. He ended the call without another word. Everything okay? I asked. He forced a smile. Just business. But he wasn't convincing anymore. Within 10 minutes, another call arrived. Then another. By 8:30, he had stopped answering altogether. Around 9 o'clock, someone knocked on our front door. Mark and I looked at each other. I'll get it, he said. When he opened the door, 2 FBI agents stood on the porch beside Special Agent Karen Morales. She displayed her credentials. Good morning. Mark stiffened. Can I help you? We're here to speak with you. He looked back toward me. Karen's eyes met mine only briefly. No acknowledgement. No sign we had ever met. Everything remained professional. Mr. Carter, one of the agents said, we'd like to ask you a few questions regarding Hamilton Strategic Solutions. Mark swallowed. Am I under arrest? Not at this time. He nodded slowly. I'll cooperate. He turned toward me. I'll be back soon. I simply answered. I know. As they drove away, I stood in the doorway watching until the SUV disappeared. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, I wasn't angry. I was grieving. The next several days passed in a blur. Television reports multiplied. Federal prosecutors announced indictments against executives from multiple contracting firms. Several companies were accused of inflating invoices, creating shell corporations, and diverting millions intended for veterans' housing and rehabilitation programs. One report estimated that more than 1,200 veterans had experienced delayed housing because of unfinished projects. That number haunted me. My father hadn't been chasing paperwork. He had been fighting for real people. Linda reacted exactly as I expected. She called repeatedly. When I finally answered, she sounded offended rather than frightened. "This is ridiculous. What is all these accusations? I haven't accused you of anything." "Rebecca." Her voice softened. "We need to stand together." I remained silent. Families don't turn on each other. Neither do honest husbands, I thought. But I didn't say it aloud. Instead, I simply replied, "I think it's best we let the investigators do their work." She hung up without saying goodbye. 3 days later, Karen asked me to meet her at the Federal Building. When I arrived, she looked exhausted. "So much paperwork," she said with a tired smile. "How bad is it?" "Worse than we expected." She opened a thick binder. "The financial records your father collected led us to accounts we hadn't found." She turned another page. "We've already recovered millions. Will the money go back?" "Most of it." "To veterans?" She nodded. "That's the goal." For the first time in weeks, I felt my father would have approved. Then Karen asked the question I had been dreading. "Are you ready to speak with Mark?" I looked away. "Does he want to see me?" He requested it. The interview took place in a quiet conference room. No handcuffs. No dramatic confrontation. Just 2 chairs, a table, and 32 years of memories sitting between us. When he walked in, he looked 10 years older. His shoulders slumped. The confidence I had always associated with him had vanished. He sat down slowly. "I'm sorry." I waited. "I don't expect forgiveness." Still, I said nothing. "I should have told you the truth years ago." "What truth?" He lowered his eyes. "I met Linda before you knew." "I know." "I was introduced to her through Hamilton." "I know." "I accepted consulting work because the money was good." He paused. "At first, that's all it was." "At first." "They realized who I was married to." The words landed softly, almost gently, yet they shattered something inside me. "They asked questions about your father." "What kind of questions?" "His schedule. Who he met. What he was working on." I stared at him. "And you told them?" He nodded once. "I thought it was harmless." "When did you realize it wasn't?" "When your father started asking questions." His voice broke. I tried to get out. "Did you?" I was afraid. I believed that part. Fear has a way of making ordinary people do extraordinary damage. Then he looked directly at me. There was one thing that wasn't a lie. "What?" "I married you because I loved you." I held his gaze for several seconds. Finally, I answered quietly, "Maybe you do." I felt tears forming. But love without honesty doesn't survive. Neither of us spoke again. As I walked toward the door, he whispered, "I'm truly sorry." I didn't turn around. That afternoon, David called. I found the last envelope. My heart skipped. "The final one?" "Yes." I drove straight to his office. He placed a cream-colored envelope in front of me. My father's handwriting covered the front. "For Rebecca, when the truth is finally known." Inside was a single handwritten page. Only one sentence: "Finish what I started." I smiled through my tears. Not because revenge had been achieved, but because justice finally had a chance to finish the work my father had begun. Every Veterans Day after that, I found myself standing in a place I never imagined would become part of my life. Not in a courtroom, not outside an attorney's office, not even at Arlington National Cemetery, although I still visited my father there every Memorial Day and every Christmas. Instead, I stood at the entrance of the Carter Veterans Resource Center in Fairfax County, Virginia, greeting men and women who had once worn the uniform my father loved so deeply. Some came looking for housing assistance. Others needed help navigating the VA system. Some simply wanted someone to listen. Dad would have understood every one of them. The center existed because the money stolen from veterans had finally been recovered and redirected where it had belonged all along. Justice had taken years. Healing would take even longer. But healing had begun. The criminal cases unfolded over the following 18 months. Several executives from Hamilton Strategic Solutions accepted plea agreements after overwhelming financial evidence was presented in federal court. Others chose to go to trial. Many were convicted. Millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts were traced through shell companies and offshore accounts before being recovered through court orders and settlements. The headlines gradually disappeared. Television cameras moved on to newer stories. That is how real life works. The people left behind continue rebuilding long after the reporters leave. Linda's trial was different. She maintained her innocence until nearly the end. Then, one afternoon, confronted with years of bank records, emails, surveillance photographs, and testimony from former associates, she agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy and financial fraud. When I saw her in the courtroom, she looked much older than she had at my father's funeral. The confidence was gone. So were the expensive clothes and carefully rehearsed smiles. Only exhaustion remained. Before sentencing, the judge allowed family members to speak. Many people expected me to demand the harshest punishment possible. Instead, I stood, adjusted the microphone, and took a slow breath. I lost my father. I paused. So did many veterans who depended on his work. I looked briefly toward Linda. What happened cannot be undone. Another pause. I ask only that the sentence reflect both justice and mercy. The courtroom became very quiet. I don't excuse what happened, but I don't want bitterness to become the final chapter of my father's life. When I sat down, I thought about something Dad used to tell young officers. Strength without character becomes power. Character without compassion becomes pride. For the first time, I truly understood what he meant. Mark chose another path. He cooperated fully with investigators. His testimony helped prosecutors untangle financial transactions that otherwise might never have been explained. His cooperation reduced his sentence. We finalized our divorce quietly. No dramatic courtroom arguments. No public accusations. Just signatures on legal documents after 32 years of marriage. A month later, I received a letter from him. Not an email. Not a text message. A handwritten letter. He apologized without making excuses. He accepted responsibility without asking me to take him back. He wrote that every day he regretted believing that one dishonest decision could remain separate from the rest of his life. It never does, he wrote. It grows until it touches everything. I cried while reading those words, not because I wanted him back, because I remembered the young man I had married. Somewhere along the way, ambition had slowly replaced integrity. It hadn't happened overnight. That realization frightened me more than anything else. None of us become the people we are in a single day. We arrive there one small decision at a time. Several months later, Colonel Bill Donovan invited me to a small ceremony honoring veterans at a community center outside Richmond. After the speeches ended, an elderly man approached me. He walked slowly with the help of a cane. His army cap had faded from years of sunlight. "You must be General Carter's daughter." "I am." He smiled warmly. "Your father saved my life in Vietnam." He reached into an old leather satchel and removed a worn black and white photograph. Two young soldiers stood beside a helicopter. One was my father. The other was the man standing in front of me. He carried me to safety after I was wounded. His voice trembled. "I've wanted to thank your family for 50 years. Then he handed me a folded envelope. "Your father asked me to give you this if anything ever happened to him." I opened it carefully. Inside was a single page written years earlier. "Rebecca, if this letter reaches you, then life unfolded differently than either of us hoped. Remember something I learned after every battlefield eventually became quiet. Winning isn't the same as healing. Never let justice become another name for hatred. The greatest victory is leaving the next generation better than the one we inherited. I love you, Dad." I couldn't hold back the tears. Neither could the old veteran standing beside me. Today, when people ask what my father left me, they usually expect me to mention the foundation, the investigation, or the recovered money. They're always surprised by my answer. He left me courage. He left me patience. He left me the conviction that truth matters even when discovering it breaks your heart. Most of all, he left me the understanding that forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is refusing to let someone else's wrongdoing decide who you become. Every Veterans Day, before the doors of the Carter Veterans Resource Center open, I pause beside the framed photograph of my father in his dress uniform. I smile. Then I unlock the front door. Some mornings an elderly veteran is already waiting outside. Sometimes it's a widow who doesn't know where else to turn. Sometimes it's a young family struggling after military service. Every time I help one of them, I feel as though my father is still quietly serving beside me. His final mission didn't end with his funeral. It simply became mine. If this story reminded you that integrity is worth protecting, that family should be built on honesty, and that justice is strongest when guided by compassion, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need that reminder today. And if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, family, and finding hope after betrayal, I'd be honored if you joined me again. Thank you for listening.